what I would say is that we've been on a wild ride for fixed income, where as rates went up, if you didn't have a term deposit, but you had, let's say, a bond fund or a variable fixed income investment, the value of those kind of tanked.
Welcome to EyeCan, a podcast about ophthalmology through a uniquely Canadian lens with Hady Saheb and myself, Heather O'Donnell. Season 5 of the EyeCan Podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. We thank them for their support.
La saison 5 du balado EyeCan vous est offerte par Bayer. Nous les remercions pour leur soutien. We will be sharing our experiences as ophthalmologists today and tackle some of the challenges we face as healthcare providers.
Jean-Francois Bordeleau is National Lead Investments Advice at MD Financial Management. JF, as he is called by his colleagues, is MD's thought leader on investment-related topics and an advisor to MD advisors.
With his team, he is responsible for educating them on MD's investment standards and principles, as well as MD's investment solutions. A graduate of McGill University, JF is a 30-year industry veteran, having spent most of those with MD. Jean-Francois, welcome to the EyeCan. This is your second guest appearance on the show. You spoke to us in season 1 about financial management for physicians. So we're really excited to learn more about this topic of capital gains and your expert perspective on some of the issues facing our colleagues right now.
Yeah, happy to be back.
So, every time we're going to talk about a specific topic, it's always good to start off with some basic definitions. So why don't you give us some background on what are capital gains and how do they differ from other forms of income, say salary or dividends?
That's a great question. I love to start with the basics. So also there's different types of income. There would be, earned income that you have, let's say, from work, and salary is the best example of that. A variation of that would be any, I'll call it benefit programs. Like, when you're in retirement, you may get, your CPP. That would be a form of income, for example. So that's more of that kind of earned income, that taxable income. And that type of income is always usually fully taxable, although you may be allowed to claim certain deduction so that it is not fully taxable. So I would say I call it type 1. The second type is the income that you earned from your investments. Interest income is one of them. Dividend is another one. And capital gain would be the third one. There is some kind of fourth one that comes in called return of capital, but I never include that one because this is getting your own money back. So you don't kind of get taxed on that. So I kind of put that one aside. So the big difference between the three would be, you usually don't earn, let's say, interest income on a stock or an equity, and you would not earn capital gain on a GIC or term deposit. So different types of investment will generate different types of income. And because of the risk that you take to earn certain type of income, the government has chosen not to tax these type of income in the same manner. So historically, or I would say in the last 10, 15 years, capital gains have usually enjoyed a lower rate because the government wants to encourage people to invest in companies. And kind of the same with dividend. And that's why interest income is usually the highest taxed option.
And so the reason the topic tonight is capital gains is really because of how hot of a topic it's become because of this change where the government proposed a new tax on capital gains. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this new proposal might affect physicians?
Yeah, so no, that's again another great question. And you've used a keyword. I just want to reiterate that is, I think, very important. It's proposal. As it stands at the moment that we are recording this podcast, this is not a law yet. This hasn't been approved, hasn't passed Parliament. So this is still a proposal, meaning that it may or may not happen. So I just kind of wanted to be clear on that. But let's assume that this proposal goes through and that, we are impacted as per the spirit of the proposal. So what the proposal is that something called the inclusion rate on capital gain. So inclusion, there's the word include in there. So the portion of capital gain that you would include in your income, which right now is 50%, so half of it would go to 2/3 or 66%. So put another way, if I realize today, $100 of capital gain, $50 would be taxed at the tax rate that is applicable to me. If the proposal does go through and becomes law, it is $67 of that same capital gain that would be taxable, ultimately resulting in a higher tax bill through those capital gains.
I think it's wild that, such a proposal is in place with it still being a proposal. There's an important proportion of our colleagues and even non-physicians, anybody corporations who have made some significant changes or sales in their investments because of this proposal, and we're still kind of in this limbo where we don't know if this is going to go through or not. So, do you have any other examples of like similar, proposals that did go through or didn't go through? Like, is there any way for us to guess whether or not this will go through?
I mean, at this point in time, I mean, it's really about a stalemate between parties in Parliament. So that's what kind of is keeping this from preventing to move forward. The only situation that kind of comes back to mind was back in the mid-2010 when there was the initial proposal to start to change small business tax rates and limits and things like that. And there was a lot of lobby done at the time, and the proposal ended up being kind of modified to an extent from its original proposal. So there were still kind of drawback, but they were not as severe, let's say, as what they were ultimately intended. So changes are possible, but usually in history, when a government says, we're increasing capital gain or we're lowering capital gain inclusion rate, most of the time it has happened. So we're in I'll call it a bit of a unique situation right now.
Interesting. So if I'm to summarize what I understood from your previous answer, capital gains are taxed in a preferential way compared to other kinds of investment income like dividends or interest. Mm-hmm. So that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. And it still is a good thing, but my understanding is it's less of a good thing now than it was before, right? Because the inclusion rate, instead of being 50% now, is 66%. How about the difference between the way capital gains are taxed within a corporation compared to on an individual level? Since a number of our colleagues are incorporated, how does that differ in terms of the capital gains taxation with this new proposal within a corporation compared to out of a corporation?
So there's a couple of ways to kind of deconstruct that question and answer. So I'll start with one thing is that even before we talk about inclusion rate and limits and all that kind of stuff, a dollar tax in a professional corporation is still taxed at a lower rate in most cases than it is personally. Like, if I receive $1 and it's taxed in my hand, and I receive $1 and it's taxed in my end, it's usually lower in the corporation. That hasn't changed. Now, what is different is that calculation of that amount that is taxable. So again, in both cases, the 67% inclusion rate would apply. But on the personal side, the proposal is that for the first $250,000, it would be at the old rate of 50% inclusion. That's for individual, that's for personal. In the professional corporation, the first $1, the inclusion rate would be 67%. So effectively, that means that a capital gain, forget the tax rate, the taxable portion of a capital gain will be higher in a professional corporation than it is at the personal level. But once you still do the math of here's my tax rate in my professional corporation, and you do the math, there's still benefits to that. So it's not that the professional corporation is useless, doesn't serve its purpose, but the big change is that there's a bigger impact on those professional corporation and not a personal, because there's not that $250,000 kind of initial threshold that gives back the old current rate of 50%.
So do you anticipate your advisors are going to start changing their advice about how physicians might even consider buying property going forward?
I would say that the advice itself is not going to change significantly. I mean, on the basis of what I said, that again, a personal corporation is still beneficial. So what you invest in is still beneficial. And, capital gain and dividends within the personal corporation are not going to be taxed much more similarly. So that there's not going to be as much of a difference. But it comes back, and what I always tell people to go back is, before you think about taxes, think about how much growth, how much return you think you're going to have from the investment. Because too often we're looking at hey, I want to save taxes, I want to lower my tax bill. But we may do that at the expense of the return on the investment, be it a property or a fund or ETF or whatever I'll call it investment might be. So sure, we'll consider the tax impact. And in some cases, we might say, well, you know what? Maybe a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. But it's going to be a bit of that case by case and depending on each situation. So that would be how I would kind of answer that one, because we've looked at that, and I said the base advice is not changing significantly. It's just, as I said, less advantageous than it was before. That's the primary thing.
Okay. So I think from your previous answer, I'm understanding about the concept of the inclusion rate and how it's affecting the overall tax burden. So I think I'm going to instead just ask you about, we know many doctors are engaging in real estate as an investment. Mm-hmm. So what do you think what do they have to know in advance about the tax implications of selling these properties in the future?
Yeah.
What do they have to keep in mind on the purchasing, on the way that they purchase?
Yeah. So let's again split personal. Mm-hmm. So let's say the only property you have is one personal property, and that's it. Nothing is really changing. That's your home, that's your primary residence. Easy case.
Great.
Personal, you've got your personal and a cottage or a second property. I know I was talking to a colleague recently, and there was a decision to make, say, okay, which one do we designate as our primary property, as our original property, like the one that we live in? Because if you're kind of 50-50, you may have a bit of flexibility there, and there might be one that has a higher gain than the other. You may have a little bit of that flexibility. Now, I'm not, talk to your accountant and verify and all that kind of stuff to make the proper designation. But that would be one thing to keep in mind, that, on the personal side, you have that. Now, if we talk about real estate in a professional corporation, it's, again, I'll go back to principle, it's an investment. So to the extent that you expect a sound rate of return, you hold the investment, could you choose or decide to dispose at a different time, or do maybe property transfers to lower the tax bill? Or, there's a couple of considerations like that you could always take. But if you're like, this is part of my prof corp, this is like, it's a clinic that I own, or other residential investment that I own, it wouldn't necessarily change, especially if you need the building for practice purpose.
Now, you mentioned a cottage and you mentioned, professional office space, but can you clarify? I think there's other considerations. Now, this may not relate specifically to capital gains, but it certainly relates to physicians and the holding of property. What about holding property for personal use versus investment? I think this also kind of loops in. And when people are thinking about how their property is being used, is it relevant there to think about?
So it might. It might to an extent, because we're looking at holding a property from a capital gain perspective. That's what we talked about. Mm-hmm. We talked about your practice. We talked about a cottage. But if you look at investing where, I don't know, you've got an apartment building, or you buy the entire building where the clinic is and you're leasing 2/3 of it, for example, now it changed things a little bit, because you are actually earning income, like actual rental income from that property. So that's not a capital gain. This is income, and then you're going to need to put money in the property to maintain it, that kind of stuff. So you've got expenses. It gets a bit more complex from that perspective, and this is something you need to take just a bit more time to think about. I don't always disclose that, but my major is real estate. That's a topic that is I'm very passionate about. And the last 20 years in Canada, we've seen real estate just go up. So people are like, I'm just going to buy real estate and nothing can go wrong. We had rates going up. So there was a fear that real estate would kind of stall and maybe go down in value. Now, we've been lucky and rates are going back down again. But that whole thing about interest rate and real estate, there's a relationship. Higher the rates are, the least people are able to afford, the least they're able to pay. If I have a mortgage on that, the more it could cost me. So the fundamentals may change and evolve. So that's one thing always to keep in mind, that there's the cost of the property, the maintenance, the interest servicing, all that kind of stuff are consideration that one would have to take into account when investing in a property, either for as a clinic and leasing out, or maybe apartments, or whatever.
Prior to this new tax proposal, did you have clear guidance to your incorporated clients about whether or not to invest in real estate on the personal side or on the corporate side? And if you did, I realize there's always a case by case, but if you were to take kind of an average incorporated physician, what was your recommendation before? And is that recommendation the same now with the new capital gains inclusion rate proposal?
So the first thing I'd say, that usually you would not hold personal property in a prof corp, because that can create issues. But the other
thing, an investment property.
No, that's an investment.
Yeah. Okay.
So the one caution to always put is that you have to be careful not to contaminate the professional corporation. Like, the purpose or primary purpose of a medical professional corporation in most provinces, the primary source of income should be the medical income. If you are earning income from those other properties, that in some case may cause an issue. This is where, if you're to do that, you may want to have a holdco, for example, or a separate company that would kind of home that kind of stuff. So this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because it depends on the goal that you have with that real estate property. I'll tell you personally, and it's just a preference. It's not a right or a wrong thing. I am not too keen on hard real assets as an investment in general, because if you do need the liquidity or you need to dispose of, then this is where you have very little controls on the gains. I mean, the gains are going to be the gains. You're going to get the market price. You're going to get whatever, and you cannot sell part of it. So let's say you need, I don't know, $1 million. And I'll take an extreme example. The only asset that you have is a $2 million property. You have to get rid of the entire property to get your $1 million. Whereas you can invest in real estate through REITs, through private real estate pools, things like that, which would give you access to invest in real estate, in some cases with liquidity. Not all cases, but if it's a REIT type structure or diversified real estate offering that is liquid, you may have that liquidity that you won't have in owning actual real property in the portfolio. So it's not that it's wrong, but these are the considerations we tell clients: how much of your assets do you have kind of locked in what I'll call illiquid assets.
So the comment you make about the hard assets, does that mean that Dr. Saheb should really rethink that watch purchase that he was going to make in his corporation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you want to be careful. I mean, this is where the accountant will provide kind of good advice.
To our listeners, I'm just kidding. I have no
I know you are.
what Dr. Saheb's investment portfolio looks like, but the opportunity was there, so I had to take it.
Yeah, no, but as tongue in cheek as the question is, it is an important thing to check with your tax professional, because sometimes, I'm just gonna kind of buy this in the prof corp and things like that. Well, is that for corporate use or personal use? And this is where it can get complicated. Like a small purchase may not trigger anything, but larger purchase, it can, if it's not done properly. I mean, there's always a way. There's always a way, but it has to be done properly.
I think it's also, it varies by province, I believe.
It does.
Some provinces allow for real estate investments to be carried out in the Medco, and others require that you have a holdco for that. So
exactly.
For our listeners, I think it depends on which province you're in.
And again, the comment I was making about investment is, it's that notion of income. So that this is where the test is very different. Like, if I buy a property, when I include a property and there's no income coming out of it, it's very different. Then it becomes an investment. You're only getting the growth. So it becomes a passive investment like pretty much anything else. So there's a couple of things there that to keep in mind. But to your point, Where some provinces have issues is if it starts to produce income.
So, as a Canadian physician, of course, in our social medical system, paying taxes feels like virtually a hobby for me.
Mm-hmm.
We pay so much tax, and I recognize it's an important, critical part of keeping our system running. But I do think that a lot of our colleagues are concerned about tax efficiency. So can you talk a bit about TFSAs and RSPs and other tax specific strategies to shelter investments from either capital gains or just practicality? Give us some of your perspectives.
Yeah, so I'll start with a concept and then I'll get into these individually. If you go back maybe 10, 15, even 20 years ago, the advice from tax and accounting professional often was, don't use the RSP, don't use a TFSA, keep the money in your Prof Corp. And that advice was good from the perspective of saving taxes today. Where maybe that advice wasn't optimal is that although you may be saving taxes today, not investing into those tax sheltered investment while there's a growth phase, especially if you're younger, there's so many years of deferred tax shelter growth that you do the math, you actually get more growth and way more growth than the tax liability you would have had up front. So most of our analysis does show that for the majority of physicians, the TFSA makes a lot of sense. And especially, the younger they are and the longer the growth period that there is in a TFSA, keep in mind the TFSA, you don't have to liquidate it at retirement. You can keep it there, you can leave it for your estate. So there's a really long runway for that TFSA. The only rule is that there's a set limit of how much you can invest in the TFSA tax-free savings account every year. So that's a nice vehicle. The RSP, I would say the logic is still there, but the one thing that's different with the RSP is that to be able to invest in that RSP, you do need to draw income. You need to pay yourself a salary. And again, you go back, I would say pre-2019, there was a big debate, salary versus dividend, which is best. And the thinking was that you would have a bias toward dividend toward most of your career, but our advice for us has never been to only do dividend, because there are some good things like social benefits like CPP and parental benefit that can come, but also having a salary. So they were usually our advice was in the early years, maybe draw a salary, earn some RSP room, and then after that, you do more of a dividend strategy. But nowadays, the difference between salary and dividend, again, depends on the province, but it's not as stark as it used to be. So getting a salary is not a bad thing. And again, when you put the dollar in the RSP, you'll get a deduction against your salary, and the money grows sheltered within the RSP until, the latest would be age 71. At age 71, you do have to convert that into what is called a RIF, and you would need to start to draw income from that vehicle at that time. There is a bit of an optimal amount. Sometimes that varies by people, so how much to have in an RSP. There's a Prof Corp and a TFSA, so we can always do that calculation of what's kind of optimal. But the RSP is good. Now, one option I will mention is that I'll say as an alternative to the RSP, there is the Medicus Pension Plan that was created exclusively for physicians. That was launched now a little over 2 years ago. That's a multi-employer pension plan. So what's different with this one is that it is actually the corporation that makes the contribution and gets a deduction, that kind of stuff. You still need to pay a salary to the individual, but the taxation of it would be a little bit different. And so I'm not going to dwell too much into that because I don't want to sound like a bit of an infomercial, but I want to make clear that this is an alternative that is there for the incorporated physician. The few little other things I can talk about, we talked about real estate earlier. You have a family member, you want to help them. Well, there's now the first home savings account that is there where you can actually contribute some money for them that will grow tax-free within certain limit for the purpose of acquiring a first property, their first home, their first property. Usually it's not going to be for yourself, but it may be. Maybe you've never had your first house and that kind of stuff. So these would be a couple of accounts that you could use to grow your money, I would say, tax effectively.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember a colleague some time ago was saying, "Oh, I'm not going to use an RSP. My corporation is my own personalized RSP that I have full control over." And that made sense to me at the time. But this experience with this capital gains inclusion rate makes it so clear to us that actually there's legislative risk with putting all your assets into the corporation because
Mhm.
as we can see the government can wake up one day and decide that the way they're going to tax your corporation is significantly different, whereas an RSP TFSA is for everybody in the population, and so the risk that the government would change the way those are taxed is much lower than the corporation. So I was always on the fence about the importance of diversifying where you're
Mhm.
investing, corporation versus RSP TFSA. But this last year has really made it clear to me that I'm going to maximize my TFSA and RSP moving forward because of the legislative risk.
Mhm.
Beyond the numbers that already sort of made sense before without considering the legislative risk. But now with the legislative risk, it emphasized that point.
Agreed. Agreed.
Um, so have your so recommendations for RSP TFSA, I think that's been clear over the years. You mentioned the Medicus pension plan, which is, I think, a branded option for an individual pension plan, is my understanding. Has your recommendation for this IPP or your MPP, has that recommendation become stronger since the new tax proposal, or were you recommending those even prior to the tax proposal?
So yes, so as far as uh, Medicus or RSP, but in the case of Medicus, which I say like we just for clarity, I mean yeah it's what they call a multi-employer pension plan, so it feels like an IPP, but because it's everybody grouped together, it works a little bit differently. So but putting that aside, yeah, our advice started when the solution was introduced, but I would say it now is potentially a bit more beneficial again because you're accruing wealth in a portfolio that is not in the professional corporation, which act, as you said, as a diversifier to your professional corporation. So your prof corp is still going to be probably the workhorse of your retirement plan. That doesn't have to change. But now you may have that new pool, which could be RSP, could be a pension plan like the Medicus pension plan, could be supplemented by your TFSA that provides that diversification of income at retirement. And then this is really a matter of optimizing. Do I draw more from here? Do I draw more from there? So there is also a reality that when you come to retirement is, where's the money coming from? And to your point earlier about having control, the levers I have controls on, where am I going to pull so that that retirement remains as tax effective as possible? So you've got a couple of things here to keep in mind and play with. So just another tool. That's how I'd like to present that.
The other bucket of investments that we haven't brought up yet is whole life insurance, and I know that
Mhm.
that's controversial as well. And so, did you, again, in general, beyond the case by case considerations, in general, for an incorporated physician, did you recommend that as an investment option? And are you recommending that any more or less since the capital gains inclusion rate proposal?
I would say we're recommended it at least as much, but we've put it back a little bit at the forefront because there is a portion of the benefits of whole life or universal life policy where the proceeds would not be taxable. There's also one thing I didn't talk about so far that is kind of changing in the professional corporation. So we talk about the inclusion rate, but there's also that little kind of side account that we call the capital dividend account or CDA. So what was happening under the, let's call it current rules or old rules, is that because the inclusion was 50%, and 50% was going to the CDA. Well, now with 67% being included, it's no longer 50%. It's only 33% that goes into that CDA. So that's one thing. And so those life insurance policies do create CDA room and all that kind of benefit and that kind of stuff. But yeah, you have to be mindful that that notion of a CDA account and some of the benefits have been somewhat altered as well. It's still there. It's still beneficial. It still kind of works. You can get money out of the professional corporation tax-free in a way through the use of that account. But again, that benefit may have been reduced a little bit. But if you're looking at holding one of those life insurance, because there's a need for the life insurance and there's a desire for the investment and tax efficiency, they are really, really good consideration in light of everything that's happening.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
Hi, my name is Dr. Louis Racine, and I listen to the EyeCan Podcast.
Jeff, thanks for kind of going through and covering a number of those investment buckets for us. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask you about how you feel the recent trend of increasing interest rates and also inflation impact our capital gain strategies for people like physicians.
It's a great yet very interesting question, because let's go back again to the taxation of each investment. So the least effective or the most taxed form of income is interest income, which is taxed at 100%. So, interest rates have been going up. I mean, they were, at a peak, you could buy a term deposit at about 5%. In the last couple of months, we've actually seen the reverse because rates in Canada and the US have pared back. They've been going kind of back down, but there was a point where you could make 5% on a very safe, secure term deposit. And you'd look at the alternative, which was equity. Now, I mean, we've been lucky. I mean, last year, the returns have been like phenomenal, like double digit, and with like what we call the Magnificent Seven, like 27%. But I go back a year and a half ago when people kind of feared the inflation, fear that rates would be going high and the equity market would take a bit of a break. We saw a big shift, not tax driven, but investment driven toward fixed income as a move to safety. Now, that wasn't, and that's normal. I mean, people say, I see a trade-off. I couldn't earn 5% guaranteed here. I don't know when I'm going to get there. Why don't I take the 5%? Not a tax-efficient decision, but psychologically, from a behavioral perspective, it kind of made sense at the time. Now, fast forward 1 year, a year and a half, that wasn't the most optimal decision based on the returns I've kind of just shared with you, but we are human beings. And the role of an advisor is to kind of try to fight a little bit some of these urges to go left or go right with a portfolio. But what I would say is that we've been on a wild ride for fixed income, where as rates went up, if you didn't have a term deposit, but you had, let's say, a bond fund or a variable fixed income investment, the value of those kind of tanked. It was a point in 2022. Yeah, I think 2020. Yeah, where the return, 2023, the return was negative 20% year over year. Yeah, that was June 2023. You're like, wow, I don't expect those safe things to go down as much. And this is where people say, well, if I'm going to get those bad returns, I'll do term deposit or I'll just go all into equities. So I would say it's not so much, again, that's a bit of a side. It's not taxed so much, but interest rates has created a couple of change in behavior. Now we're back to rates kind of going down. And what we've seen, we were talking about real estate earlier. Real estate has actually done really good in the last 6 months because of rates going back down. So valuations are going back up. The banks have been doing better. So the type of investments that are now doing better is different than the type of stuff that was doing well 6, 12, 18 months ago. Should someone change their strategy in light of that? I would say if your risk profile hasn't changed, if your goals and objectives haven't changed, for the most part, whatever strategy you had was probably the right strategy. On the margin, maybe a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. But usually that would not warrant something significant in terms of shift, because what's happening now in 5, 10, 15 years is going to be a blimp on the overall rate of return. So I don't know if that's kind of where you wanted to go with that question. I'm happy to answer any follow-up, but that would be some of my thoughts on that question at the moment.
Yeah. I feel like whenever I ask a question about like, oh, how would this, environmental change impact your investment strategy? I feel like the simple answer is don't change your investment strategy, right? Just,
True.
make a plan, ignore the noise, and just stick to it. But it's so hard to do in
I'm
practice.
sure it's a diverse plan.
Yeah, but it's so hard to do in practice. Yeah.
It's hard. Without dwelling on that point, I mean, studies have been made that the worst enemy to one's return is oneself.
Mm-hmm.
The market in any given year on average over the last 20 years would have returned, let's say 8%. The average investor return over that same time period is about 2%, which is barely inflation, due to their own action. So I'll leave it at that on that topic.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to ask you a question later about pitfalls and what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that that's the answer, is that we perhaps over-engage and over-manage or shift direction as a result of changing environments and climate. So can you comment on that and actually maybe even divide it up for us? Like, what are the big mistakes that we make in our early careers that you see? And I have a question about, has it been your experience that ophthalmologists do this more or less than other physicians? Like, are we a bad actor in the investment game? Do we kind of have our crap together? What do you think? Like, I'm curious.
You're almost forcing me to talk about a couple of different specialties and some of the biases that they may have. And, I do the training and onboarding of some of our advisors. So I'll just put ophthalmologists aside for a moment. And sometimes we talk about one group of physicians that have a like for do-it-yourself investing. And I say, well, what is technical investing? Well, you look at a chart or a picture, you see trends or inflection point, and based on those charts, you pose a diagnosis, and you decide your investment course. Well, what's the medical specialty that takes and looks at pictures all day, try to make decisions to what's going on, and then set a course of action or makes it, well, this is what's going on. Well, you have radiologists where I've been kind of trained to do that. Where I'll go back with ophthalmologists and dermatologists, and I will group them together, is that there is actually a significant difference in that group, is that as a group versus most other specialties, you own more equipment, you often own and operate your clinic. Some of you may receive more private income. So there's maybe I'll call it a bit more of that entrepreneurial spirit. And hence the question that I got earlier around real estate, that would be more common, I think, with groups like ophthalmologists, dermatologists, not exclusively, but there's that kind of more familiarity with what I'll call the business side of medicine. So that's how I'm gonna maybe answer that portion of that question.
I'll take it. I like it.
Yeah, but to come back to the pitfalls, I'll take that one even in a slightly different direction. Is that right now it's very hard for people to actually know themselves as an investor. And the reason for that is that the last significant market downturn that we've had was in 2008. COVID doesn't count. The market was down maybe 40%. It was up like 3 months after that. So that was really a blip. So the last real prolonged market downturn was 2008. That is 16 years ago. You have a full generation of investor that has never experienced a market downturn. And you also have a full generation of advisor that has never experienced a market downturn. So to talk about risk and risk management and diversification, when last year the market was up 22%, the person will say, well, I don't care about risk. I mean, why would I care? I mean, the market just goes up, and when it goes down, it comes back 2 months after or 3 months after. So I don't want to call it a mistake, but one of the biggest risks right now is that lack of understanding and knowledge of what risk is. Now, the flip side, as I say this, people say, oh, are you saying I should have fixed income or a safe portion of my portfolio? And that would be the conventional wisdom. The challenge that we see right now is that with those rates kind of being much lower than the long-term norm, and let's assume that they stay there for the long term, that fixed income portion may not provide enough of a oomph. It's still going to provide a cushion, but not enough of a oomph. So that's why it's important to have actually the right risk amount in a portfolio, which means having the right amount of not only equities. The challenge with equities right now is that as people avoid fixed income and dump monies into equities becoming expensive. Oops, where do I go? And this is why you're starting to see a big push to what is called private assets. Stuff that is not in the market, that is sold a bit differently, in different structure, that kind of stuff. So I kind of took your question the other way to say that, so the biggest pitfall or mistake would be to, while having a diversified portfolio, not kind of see that there can be some evolution to a strategy with new solutions, with things that are shifting a little bit. So from time to time, it's okay to move from one type of solution to another, to rebalance a portfolio and things like that. The challenge is when you do it too often, number one. And number two, when you don't have a proper assessment of what your own risk tolerance and capacity is. Those will be the two kind of biggest thing. And maybe number three, if you allow me.
Yeah.
We've been talking about taxes a lot today. That focus on tax at all cost I'm not saying is problematic, it can be problematic. And one example I used there, going back in the 1990s, there was a product called Labor-Sponsored Venture Capital Fund. In Quebec, Fonds des Travailleurs, but most of these funds, provided a 30% tax credit. The vast majority of them kind of just went bankrupt or provided no return. So yeah, I got a 30% tax credit, but no return, and now stuck with no value. So that's one thing to be careful, to just say, hey, I'll invest on this because of tax. That is a mistake that can be made. So long answer, but again, I'll just kind of, I think, stop it there for now.
No, that's great. And your answer sort of harkens back when I think about the various components of your answer. I'm reminded of, because I've recently listened again to your original JF, for our listeners, was a guest in season 1 and talked about a variety of investment options, but also really focused on, don't forget that this is part, when we're speaking about these financial issues, we're speaking about one part of financial planning, and that making sure that you're not considering your investments is the only part of your financial plan.
Yeah. No, that's right. Thanks for that.
JF, there was another term I would love to hear you talk about, which is the concept of lifetime capital gains exemption, and how this can impact or benefit physicians who are selling their practice either at some point during their career or at the time of retirement.
That's an excellent question. And so this is where, again, I know tonight I'm talking with ophthalmologists. My answer will be slightly different than if I were talking to other physicians. Because a typical physician in their prof corp, they would primarily have what we call passive investment. So mutual fund, ETFs, they would not have, property into that is used to produce income in the business. So as such, they would not qualify as a small business under that lifetime capital gain exemption measure. There's kind of two tests where at the time of sale, 90% of the assets have to be totally related to producing income for the business, not the portfolio, for the business. And there's a threshold of 50% in the previous 2 years. So most professional corporations do not meet that test. And as such, they cannot use that exemption. But let's say that, and I'm not going to do the math, but you have a sizable portfolio, but the value of the clinic that you have or the building that you own is huge. You have equipment in there, and the value is, again, significant. Then the accountant can make calculation, and maybe this is where they may start to reduce part of the portfolio, so that if you choose to sell your practice, you are able to claim that that credit, that amount of deduction from the total gain of selling that business. So it is a possibility that not all medical specialties can, because again, they're not all as capital intensive as, I'll say, ophthalmology or dermatology may be. So I don't want to say that, yes, sure, do it. It's applicable. I say it may be applicable, but here's the catch. It's not a practice that you're selling. It's the shares of the professional corporation. And that's very important. You are selling your business. You are not selling the practice. And that's a big difference. If you sell all the equipment in the building and you're keeping the Prof Corp as is, you cannot claim that because it's the assets that you sold. So you really have to say, I am selling the Dr. Saheb Prof Corp to Dr. O'Donnell. And basically, Dr. O'Donnell buys the assets of that. And this is where, with the gain that you would have, Dr. Saheb, this is where, again, there's an amount that you can claim as that credit to reduce the amount of taxable capital gain. And the rest of the gain then would be applicable at that, let's call it new 67% rate.
Okay. So looking forward, obviously with the proposal that's pending right now, this is certainly would fall into this category, but are there other proposed changes to capital gains legislation in Canada that physicians should be aware of? And how might this affect our strategy going forward beyond the one that we've talked about?
There's a couple of parts to that question. I'll try to kind of deconstruct some of those. So I would say, for those that are not incorporated right now that may be listening and maybe younger ophthalmologists thinking of the pros and the cons, mathematically it still makes sense to incorporate. That math hasn't changed for most people that retain a lot of earning in the Prof Corp. So that is a bit of a check. That's not going to change our strategy. From an investment strategy, investment that produce capital gain or dividend still tax more favorably than investment that produced interest income. Now you might say, are there investments that don't produce any of that? At time of disposition, you can never get away with a gain or a loss unless something has been like a term deposit that doesn't change in value. But there are some investments like a mutual fund or ETF that can produce that income as well. We'll pay what we call distributions on a regular basis. There are some investments out there that may be lower distribution, that may withhold distribution. I'll say on those, the concept of it looks cool. The challenge is that sometimes they keep the tax impact in the structure. So there's a structure that pays the taxes, not you. But if they pay the taxes, that reduces the return. So either you get a higher return and you pay the tax, or you get a lower return and they pay the tax. Ultimately, you're not necessarily better off one way or the other. So I'm not saying don't pay attention to the income distributed by those investments. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. But in some cases, a lot of marketing is made about investment that retain or cancel distribution. And, you need to look under the hood to see if they really make sense. Well, your asset allocation wouldn't necessarily change significantly. We talked about life insurance as an option earlier. We talked about the RSP, TFSA, or the Medicus. So these are things that maybe you didn't think about before that you may want to give a second chance at. Here's one thing that people don't necessarily think about to deal with a capital gain liability. You may have losses, and sometimes it may make sense to actually realize those losses. You have an investment in which you've lost total faith in. You don't think it's going to recover the value. It's going to take too long to recover the value. Those losses that you realize will offset some of the gains that you have. So sometimes it makes sense to just take that loss and say, you know what, I need to move on to another investment. That's one strategy. Some people will do the opposite of crystallizing the gain. They'll crystallize a loss. But there's a big difference when you crystallize a loss. The government kind of says, you can buy and sell the same investment and create a gain, and I'll tax you on it, and I'm very happy for it. But if you do the same thing with a loss, where you sell the investment today and you buy it tomorrow, I'm not going to allow the loss, because they'll call that a superficial loss. There needs to be, I'll give the simple explanation. You need to have 30 days in between basically the time that you dispose of and the time that you rebuy the same security for it to count as a loss. Now, there are alternatives, because if the market's to go up in the month and you're out of an investment, you might be like, ooh, not a smart call to do. So if you have a Canadian equity product, maybe you invest into a Canadian equity index product for the month that you're kind of out of that investment. So there's a couple of things that you can do so that you don't run afoul of a tax loss, but look at the losses, talk to your accountant whether it may make sense to trigger some of those losses, talk to your investment professional to see if there's some strategy that could make sense to temporarily trigger some of these losses, because that could help deal with some of the gains. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying take losses just for the sake of taking losses. There are some times where we don't have those, or you shouldn't try to actually create them. But if you have access to them, it's a tool, like anything else.
It's great advice. It's really comprehensive. I appreciate that. Lots of different facets and considerations here. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, as we wrap up this great episode, we at the EyeCan tend to want to hear from our guests what they like to do outside of their professional lives. So, what can you share with us about what you like to do outside of work?
So for work, I travel a lot for business, which means also like to travel a lot for pleasure. And people that are close to me know that I'm I'll call it a bit of a diehard Disney fan. Not just the parks, but the cruises. So I will be spending my holidays at sea. And that's something that, we just wanted to try, this year. I mean, we've done some of the cruises before, but that is something that we just love the experience, and it's a great family offering for us. So it's one of my kind of passions. Yes, I like reading, I like books, moving, that kind of stuff, but this is the one thing that kind of gets me going.
That's great. I've heard from many parents that it's just amazing because, your kids are so happy, and happy kids, lead to happy parents on holiday. And so have you been going for a long time? Has it spanned like kids of different ages? Like, what's the range? In my mind, I always had in mind that this was like for a certain window of time in your kids' lives, but you're making it sound like you've been doing this for a long time. So tell me more about, the range of kids' ages that have worked out with the Disney cruises.
So, I mean, I have personally just one daughter. Her first cruise, she was 4 years old. And now her cruise number 17, which is going to be on this holiday, she's now 13, almost 14 years old. And she doesn't like the same things. Like, at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, this is all about line up to see the princesses, meeting the characters, going to the shows, all that kind of stuff, the kids club. Now it's about meeting with other teenagers on the ship, being more responsible, doing our own things, grabbing a slice of pizza at 10 p.m., watching a movie with the friends that she met. I mean, she has friends from all over the world because of that. And she still like usual WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever, just to kind of stay in touch. And so we've gone to Europe twice. We've done Southern Caribbean. We've done Alaska, Panama.
You're inspiring a travel podcast here.
It's been suggested to me that maybe one day, if you ever do like, cruises and Disney, I mean, I would definitely be willing to come back for something like that.
Well, you're an excellent guest, JF, so we'll make sure to keep that in mind.
Awesome.
Jeff, this has been so useful. This tax proposal has been on the minds of most of us ophthalmologists across the country. And so thanks for taking the time to share your expertise in covering so many topics directly and also indirectly relevant to this tax proposal. So really, this is very much appreciated, and thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me. I mean, it was a pleasure to be back for a second time and have the opportunity to talk about this very timely and important topic.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We look forward to bringing you more engaging content over the coming months. EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cbc.ca. cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
Season 5 of the EyeCan Podcast is brought to you by Bayer Ophthalmology. We thank them for their support.
La saison 5 du balado EyeCan vous est offerte par Allaire. Nous les remercions pour leur soutien.
Thank you from the Canadian Ophthalmological Society. EyeCan is available wherever you listen to your podcasts and, of course, through the COS Practice Resource Center.
EyeCan est disponible partout où vous écoutez vos balados et bien sûr au Centre de ressources pour la pratique de la SCO.
EyeCan is written and directed by Kim Tytler and produced by John Allaire from Allaire Strategic Works.
EyeCan est écrit et réalisé par Kim Tytler et produit par John Allaire d'Allaire Strategic Works. Some episodes this season will include relevant links and show notes, so be sure to check episode descriptions to learn more. Certains épisodes de cette saison incluront des liens pertinents dans les notes d'émission, alors n'oubliez pas de consulter les descriptions des épisodes pour en savoir plus.
If any of our listeners have topic ideas to submit, please email them to communications@cos-sco.ca and we will review for consideration.